All right, I'll begin. Good evening. I'm Mary Holt, current president of the Shebig Island Historical Society. Welcome and thank you for joining us on Zoom for the Historical Society's Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture Series, established by Cap Leonard. The Board of Trustees offers sincere thanks to Cap for his continued support of the lecture series. Also worthy of great appreciation is our Zoom facilitator, Richard Hackle. Those who wish to support the efforts of the Historical Society may donate online at shebighistory.com. Before commencing with the lecture, I wish to acknowledge and honor the indigenous people who were first to inhabit Shebig, forage its fields and forests, and fish its waters. Questions relative to the lecture can be addressed during the lecture. Our lecturers welcome the interaction, so we do ask you to please type your question in the chat box first and select to everyone, and we'll make sure that our lecturers see those questions. During the lecture, we're going to ask you to please turn off your video and mute your audio. And when you are going to ask your question, just turn your audio back on. Tonight's lecture, Maine Fisheries Past, Present, and Future, will be presented by Alex Todd, 10th generation fisherman and chairman of the board of directors of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association, and Alan Tracy, president of Vessel Services in Portland and appointed at-large member of the New England Fishery Management Council. At this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce Alex and Alan. Take it away.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mary. And hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. It sounds like you've had quite a few esteemed presenters to your lecture series, so we're glad to be a part of it and talk about commercial fishing. I'm Alan Tracy. Alex Todd is here. Maybe quite a few of you know Alex as a long-term Shebig Island resident. You know, the kind of the format and the structure that we put together to go through tonight, just to give you an idea of what to expect. You know, we're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to talk about our connection to the industry, the fishing industry. Spend some time talking about the regulatory structure of commercial fishing in the different jurisdictional areas, obviously some of the history, definitely some of the challenges on specific fisheries, and then maybe towards the end, talk about some current issues that are in the news and that are getting quite a bit of attention and how they interact with some of the other things that we've talked about. I think it's a kind of a launching point. And you're going to hear, you know, Alex and I kind of go back and forth with some different things that we thought each of us made sense to talk about. But I think it's a launching point just to say at the beginning, you know, is to acknowledge how important commercial fishing is in Maine. As I introduce myself and talk about where I'm from, you know, one of the reasons I'm here is because Mary and I share a history ourselves going back to where we're from in northern Connecticut, in Enfield, Connecticut. And Mary and I connected here. Each of us found our way, obviously Mary to Shebig, and I live in Freeport. Certainly my background and my family background is not in commercial fishing. We all can't be the Todds and have 10 generations behind us. But my background is more, I have been a lawyer. I was a lawyer here in Connecticut and in Maine. I've lived in Maine for 20 years. I found my way to Vessel Services, which is on the Portland Fish Pier in Portland, about 12 years ago as a result of a big embezzlement that the company had. And then I was part of solving some of the fallout from that. And through that experience, I began to manage Vessel Services. I became an owner of Vessel Services, and today I am the sole owner of Vessel Services. So that was about 12 years ago. Just to kind of give you an idea of, if you're not familiar with Vessel Services, what we do, we are on the Portland Fish Pier. We and the Portland Fish Exchange are really kind of I think what a lot of people refer to as the backbone of commercial fishing, certainly down here in the Portland in the Portland region. We supply the boats with ice, fuel, and gear. Obviously, at the Fish Exchange is where they unload the catch. It gets auctioned and sold, boxed up and trucked to various parts. Both those businesses were formed about 40 years ago for a particular fishery, which was the groundfish fishery, which we'll talk about. But right now, I'm just kind of setting out my connection to the industry. So through Vessel Services, we're very close to all of the working boats in our region, certainly fishing vessels will come for different reasons. And one of the unique things about Vessel Services is that all of the different fisheries are represented. It's not just groundfish boats. It's not just lobster boats or scallop boats. The aquaculture folks are here, are with us, and anyone else who's working on the water. Many of you in the islands, certainly the boat yards, et cetera, will come for different reasons. So that's my connection through that activity and being a part of that community and being a part of the Fish Exchange and being a part of some of the state discussions that are had around commercial fishing. About 3 years ago, I was appointed to the New England Fisheries Management Council, and I'll talk more about what the council is, but it's a federal council that manages all of the New England federal waters and the marine species in those waters. And we set catch specifications. We deal with things like habitat. And again, I'll talk a little more specifically about that. But I also want to say what my connection to Mary is, which Mary and I go way, way back. Our families go way, way back. And I was actually at Mary's wedding. So I know some of you, and that was quite a while ago, but I'm not going to ask how long ago that was. But Mary and John are important parts of my family history. And that was back in Connecticut. And it's kind of funny to be here now. So that's kind of the introduction to me. And I do want to say, I'm going to pass it off to Alex now. You can introduce himself. He'll talk much more interesting about his long family history there on the island, but how important fishing is in all of our communities. Again, I think I said I'm from Freeport, which is certainly a coastal community, has a big fishing community as well. And and I know, and anyone who lives on the coast of Maine, or really anyone who lives in the coast in Maine, how important and how deep the connection to the fishing culture industry is, and how important it is. And you don't have to be a fisherman to know that. And I think that'll be a theme that we'll talk a little bit about here. So with that said, I'm going to pass it off to Alex to introduce himself and talk a little bit more about the history and his connection to the island.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Alex Todd, generational fisherman from Shebig. And for me, a large part of my island identity, my state identity is fishing. And I think if we look back even 100 years, we see how much change has been in it. I mean, there was so much of the fishing community's income was inshore stop, seine herring, which seems to have moved on, and so much groundfish stuff. And now we seem to be left largely with lobster. But so many of my early memories, I don't remember anything before being on a boat. I mean, it's just crazy how the ocean and the island and everything gets in your system, and you can't get rid of it. Not that you want to, but I'm not the best speaker, I'll tell you that one. At least on
well, and Alex and I agreed that when and if I was going to prompt him, we had a long discussion about maybe the good launching is talking about some of you were talking about some of your great uncles and how they would travel down the coast of the whole eastern seaboard, pursuing their in wooden dories and sailboats, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm sure most of you know the story, but Sanford Doughty, my great uncle, I can't shake the story of him telling about the day that his brother was lost coming back from sword fishing down off New York, They spent however long out on a trip, came into the Fulton Fish Market, came back through the Cape Cod Canal, and somewhere along the way, his brother went overboard. And I remember Sanford telling the story, or I remember actually my grandfather was on the boat telling the story of how his father would walk up and down the deck yelling for his son and beating his chest like King Kong. How do you get over that? But yeah, we keep going back to the ocean after we experience it.
And Alex, your family and going back, a couple generations of people that you even know, your grandfather, your grandparents, your great uncles, etc. How many of them made their living through commercial fishing in whatever different capacity or whatever different fishery they were pursuing at the time?
At one point, I tried to add it up, and at that particular time, it was me, my brother, my sister, my father, one grandfather, three great grandfathers. I'm right. And I can't remember how many uncles and 75 cousins and stuff. It's just such a huge portion of at least the last century's history for my family in this area.
Yeah, and I'll just interject. One of the interesting things about my role where I go every day at Vessel Services is you really get a feeling for the different families that come from the different area. For instance, obviously Shebig, everyone knows the Todds on Shebig. There are representative families from Long Island, from Harpswell, from Phippsburg, and then going south, there's the Cape Elizabeth crew, and how multi-generational to this day, these families continue to be represented in the different fisheries. But when I talk about, Alex, maybe talking back to those times, how people used to pursue different fisheries. Today, it's much different. One of the things we'll talk about today is how things have gotten a little bit, because of licensing, because of the regulatory structure, what's happened with people pursuing, now we have many, many more people that they're a lobsterman. There's the lobsterman, there's the ground fisherman, there's the scallop guys. Back in the day, Alex, we were talking, it wasn't as much like that. Is that the case?
Well, back in the day, you could just get a license, call up and get one. If one species was hot, that's the one everybody followed. Now, if you don't have the license, it's a struggle to get it, if that's what you're going for. I mean, a kid today is definitely finding it hard to get wide open options.
Exactly. And that's, that might be a good segue for me to start talking about the kind of the regulatory structure and just and how things have changed. Because of course, I think everyone who follows it recognizes that fisheries are highly, highly regulated now. And I think we'll keep bouncing back to how it used to be. And a good marker for when things began to change is about 1976, particularly with the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. For federal fisheries, that was the moment where things began to change, and not just on the federal level, but obviously as kind of the leader in management, it trickled down to the state and even local level. And folks who are aware, the 70s was a time, 60s and 70s were a time where these massive legislative acts were being passed, clean water and clean air and some of the things that were happening at the time. And the Magnuson Act kind of fit along with that. And it was specifically geared towards managing our fisheries and moving towards a sustainable structure. Today, the word sustainable is actually in the act, as it's been reauthorized a couple different ways. The Magnuson Act did a couple different things. Again, kind of there's this before Magnuson and after Magnuson when we talk about how the fisheries are structured. before it was kind of a hodgepodge of regulations, departments, oversights. But just like Alex is saying, and certainly your history on the island will reflect, people could participate. They were open fisheries for I think for all of them. And it would depended on the season. It depended on the abundance. It depended on, what people had the capacity and the equipment to do, whether it was inshore herring, as Alex was talking about, obviously ground fish through tub trawls, and people always caught lobster, scallops, and even oysters were very abundant in Casco Bay in general. And so people could participate with those really in a free, open way. Magnuson changed that, not just because there was pressure on populations, but particularly, and some people on the call may remember, I hear people talk about this all the time in Portland, there was foreign fishing presence in our what was considered to be our territorial waters. Many people in Portland who are still around today will talk about the Russian trawlers that used to be parked right outside the harbor, right inside the harbor. And Magnuson addressed that. Magnuson did a couple things. I'm not going to go all the way deep, but one of the things it did was set what's referred to today as the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone, which is the 200-mile limit, which declared that from 3 miles, 3 miles in is where is state managed, and 3 miles to the 200 miles is what's referred to the EEZ. Magnuson established that, which kept foreign fishing interests out of that zone and made it exclusively for American interests and our fishing community's interests. So that's one of the things that it did. Magnuson set up the council system, which I'm a part of now, which I'll talk a little bit about, which created regional fisheries management councils for each of the geographic areas of the United States. Today, there are 8 different fisheries management councils. We have New England, we have mid-Atlantic, there's a Southern Atlantic, there's a Caribbean, there's a Western Pacific, there's an Alaskan, a Pacific. There's 8 different councils, and what those are made up of are appointees who are appointed by their state governors, and also fisheries officials from the states that populate those councils, and they're mostly stakeholders. I happen to be a business person involved, very connected to the industry. That was my connection. But you have many fishermen who are appointed to the council. You have conservation organizations and people from conservation organizations who have seats on the council, and all of those stakeholders get together to make recommendations, to receive reports, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The councils and the Magnuson set out for the councils and all of fisheries management to be guided by what's referred to as the national standards. Okay, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but what I'm trying to do is to explain, a basic regulatory framework for how fisheries are currently managed. And again, I'm talking about right now the federal fisheries. Obviously, we have state fisheries managers, and then we also have even local. Some fisheries management, particularly clam flats and clamming, is managed through a local system. So these 8 councils are established, and we manage the marine species within that specific area. You can imagine that's not an easy thing to do, especially now in the era of climate change with shifting temperatures, shifting stocks. That would be by far one of the biggest challenges that we're facing, any council's facing, but there's no question that in New England, it's creating enormous challenges for how stock assessment is done, how fishery management plans are managed, what standards that we use to set quotas and annual specifications, et cetera, et cetera. It's really creating quite a bit of challenges. But beyond the actual species, then the councils also have jurisdiction and management responsibilities for some of the for the ecosystem itself. So for instance, we have a habitat committee in our council, which talks about obviously protected areas of the ocean, but also things like offshore wind, aquaculture proposals in federal waters, all go through this system. And we make recommendations because we're seen as kind of the trustees. That's really how I see the job, and that's how many of us refer to it, as we are to act in the best interests of the resource. But guided by these national standards, if you want to truly understand fisheries management today, it's important to understand the national standards, okay? And those are 10 different standards which set out really the guiding principles of how fisheries are managed. The first and the most important by far is the concept of maximum sustainable yield, literally what we call MSY in almost everything that we do. How do you get the maximum yield out of the resource in a sustainable way? This is where you will hear terms. You will often hear terms, for instance, just to hopefully put things into context, you will hear reference to when they talk about codfish, which is one of our managed species, being in an overfished state or overfishing is occurring. Those terms are actually right out of the Magnuson Act. It's how it defines sustainability, whether it's in an overfished or overfishing state. Now, hopefully, if anybody who kind of digs into this enough, and certainly I had my own process for this, is saying, well, why do they always call it overfished and overfishing? Because when you participate in the process, for instance, take codfish, which was quite a bit in the news in the last few years because of its stock status, and then all of the cuts that came to codfish across New England in our fisheries. And they call it, it was overfished. However, what's important to understand is that the fishermen are receiving the quotas from the council, which then makes recommendations to what's commonly referred to as NEFMC, the National Marine Fisheries Service. And so it's the council recommends based on the science that's presented to us, and we do not have a lot of wiggle room because we're obligated through those national standards to take the best available science. And whatever that best available science is, even if it's really thin, and this happens, a good example is during the pandemic, where typically the science emerges from a couple different sources, but one of the main sources where the science on stock assessment comes from is from the bottom trawl surveys, which are done all across New England in federal waters and different, and they're done in a very systematic way. Where there's a couple of vessels, NOAA vessels. One is the Bigelow and the Albatross, which sometimes you hear people talk about, and especially fishermen will complain about. I mean, Alex, I don't know if you want to talk about what people talk about the Bigelow. I mean, this is a good example. I mean, you know what they do and what the complaints are.
Yeah, I mean, I like trawl surveys in some ways, but any trawl survey, as you said, the fish where they are is affected by the temperature of the water, the weather that day, the moon phase, all kinds of stuff. So that is a good tool.
I'm watching Alex.
What's that?
I think someone was on mute.
Yeah, but to blind, you need a lot more than just the trawl survey, in my opinion, to get a real assessment of the stock.
Exactly. And you'll hear that all the time. I mean, we'll hear that at the council. Fishermen will come in and not only everything Alex just said about, where the fish are based on temperature. These are timed surveys where they're going to certain spots, certain coordinates and towing. And then what comes up in those nets is what's counted and assessed to then inform to be put into models to determine the abundance of specific stocks. And all the things Alex just said are absolutely true. You'll also hear fishermen complain about that they don't even know how to run the nets. These are otter trawls, and these are fairly, they certainly have ex-fishermen on board, but there's particulars to the equipment. And I'll often hear, standing at the counter in vessel services, when people get into this type of thing, they'll talk about the Bigelow doing a tow based on certain coordinates, and then they'll have a fishing vessel towing right beside it. And of course, the two bags that come up are vastly different, because the complaint is that they don't know what they're doing on the Bigelow. Alex, you want to talk about that just for a second? The otter trawl, like how that works, the use of doors, and for dragging. That's kind of an interesting thing.
Sure, where it got its name, the otter trawl, I have actually no idea. But I mean, it's a soft mouth net that's basically a funnel, we'll say, with like weighted rubber on the bottom that helps it bounce over, rocks and things, and floats on the top that open the top of the mouth. And then there's trawl doors, like it's metal, but like a sheet of steel that when you're towing it through the water with a wire to each door, that acts like a fairing on the tailgate of your car and spreads the net sideways. So the float's floated up, opening the top of the mouth, the rubber sinks the bottom of the mouth, and the doors spread it sideways, and you end up with like a funnel towing through the water, and the fish collect in the back of it.
Exactly. And you can imagine with anything that goes wrong in that, whether it's wire length or something getting fetched up, you're essentially towing a big string through the water, and it's not working. So again, I'm not, the science that goes into this is, it depends on where it comes from, but the bottom trawl survey is just one source, but it is certainly one of the keystones of where I'm, going back to this idea of the best available science. And so I'm giving it for instance of what happens. We just had a situation recently because of the pandemic. And as you can imagine, the Bigelow was not sailing. They were not doing their surveys. We would get notices talking about which ones they had to miss. So we were left with very, very thin data. Okay. And of course, another source can be the market, but that's effort. That's, if guys aren't fishing, if there's no market, in this particular instance, it happened to be with monkfish, which is a really, really important fishery here in Maine, and becoming more. Monkfish is a type of groundfish, but it's actually managed separately from the multi-species groundfish category. And monkfish, to give an example of how this science-based how important science is to the process. We were receiving reports that were based on very few tows of these bottom trawl survey vessels. And then we were also being presented saying, well, we only have so many tows, and of course they only catch 1 or 2 monkfish per tow. Okay. And then we were going to market data, but it was during the pandemic, so nobody was fishing because there was no market for monkfish. Those are the 2 data sources that we had as counselors to set specifications. And the recommendation was, because those things were not showing, was that the recommendation was to dramatically cut the quotas for the upcoming years. Okay, these are the things that you hear about when they talk about, the cod being cut. It's all based on, at some point science is done, at some point science is presented and analyzed, and then it goes through this regulatory process where recommendations from the council go to NEFMC that actually set those quotas. And that's when you finally hear about it in the newspaper. You're going to hear, I can tell you right now, everyone is familiar with what happened with cod in the last 5 or 6 years. Well, you don't hear as much about cod because that's been processed through, fishermen make the adjustments. Last year, there was a huge problem with white hake. This year coming up, it's going to be Gulf of Maine haddock, because Gulf of Maine haddock just got cut by about 85%. Alex, that's a good thing. Do you want to talk about how choke species work in this, within this system?
Well, now with an IFQ, an individual fishing quota for most every ground fish, if too much of any of the species get caught, then it shuts down the whole fishery. So any species with a really small amount of overall quota that every boat combined can catch, if some random boat, if it starts getting up near that number, it shuts the whole fishery down. So everybody, we used to try to catch all the fish we can. Now a lot of the fish we try to avoid, some of the species as much as we can.
That's right. Yeah, and there's a leasing system that's grown up around cat shares, where within your sector you can lease fish from others. If the way permits are working now with this, again, we're kind of moving towards this super regulated system, and all of these different quotas that are set, we're just talking about ground fish right now. And just to kind of take a step back, when we refer to ground fish, we're talking about a multi-species category that's managed in one fishery management plan. And ground fish is comprised of both, round and flat fish. This is where your cod, your haddock, your pollocks, redfish, all of your different flat fish are part of that multi-species. They all get managed together. Yet each of those individual species has a stock assessment connected to them. And so, for instance, cod, when cod gets cut, certain times of the year, and again, Alex can talk about this better than I can, you can't stay away from codfish, because the reason they're all managed together is because they all exist together. That's what we call a choke species. Because when cod gets cut, and like I said, people have gotten around cod. Now, last year was white hake. It was very difficult to stay away from the white hake if you listen to the guys who are ground fishing. And so it becomes a choke species. So once the permit that you have in the individual fishing quota that you have a certain number of pounds of white hake or codfish, or again, coming up, it's going to be Gulf of Maine haddock. Once you catch that amount in your annual allocation, it's over. You can't fish anymore. Now, through the system of a sector system, which we'll talk about a little bit later, people can trade. There are many fishermen now that hold these permits. Okay. And again, we're talking about the ground fish fishery right now that hold permits that don't fish, but just lease their quota. So their white hake can be leased. The problem is lately, just using hake as the example, hake was leasing for $1.40 per pound. It was selling for less than that at the auction. So fishermen would have to lease hake just to go and try to stay away from it. As Alex just said, you hear people talk about this all the time. It's not fishing, it's trying to stay away from certain fish. They already stay away from the cod. You cannot catch the cod. So they stay far away from the cod, stay away from the hake so that you can fish on whatever you have. Maybe you have pollock, or maybe you have redfish, or maybe you have dabs, or whatever it happens to be. And it's really remarkable to see, what's happened and the efforts that have to be gone through to stay away from certain fish. Alex, you want to talk about that, like the seasonality? And I know you're not doing ground fish right now, but certainly you have a ground fish permit, you've done it, and like the different ways that people, we've talked about the otter, the dragging, the trawling. There's also gill netting is very, very, I would say even there's more gill net boats, quite honestly, in our area now than there are draggers. And you want to talk about a gill net, Alex, how that works, and the different types of bottom?
Alex, before you talk about the gill net, we have a question. Do you have to throw away the fish that you catch that are over quota?
Do. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, this is a really good question, and it brings us to the topic of observers. Okay. Yes, you do. You really can't fish anymore if you're over. Okay. And you have to, I'm going to step back. Alex, you talk about like the trip reports that are made, how a fishing trip is assessed on board, how that data is accumulated. Do you mind talking about that a little bit? I think this is a good question to kind of enter that.
From 99 until last year, I had to fill out and send in a paper report for everything I caught, where I caught it, how I caught it, all that stuff. As of last year, it's electronic. So some of the species, before I get to the dock, I have to send in a report for I caught this much or whatever. Yeah, you have to throw away stuff that you catch that's over your limit, but you still have to account for it. If you have, maybe you can't bring it in, but somebody's quota has to cover that. You have to get enough quota to cover whatever you kill, basically, is the end result in it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where bycatch comes in too, not just of the actual species itself that you're over on, but there's size restrictions on some fish. There's all kinds of bycatch, especially in, you can imagine when a bag comes up with whatever's in it. Of course, a lot of people know that in Maine, one of the reasons our groundfish fishery has suffered so much is because Maine has a state rule that lobsters caught any other way than in a trap or by hand, I think in some instances, cannot be landed in the state of Maine. Whereas the federal rule is that on a federal groundfish trip, again, with, that is declared to be a targeted groundfish trip, boats can keep 500 pieces, 500 lobsters on that trip. I think it's really 100 per day. So you'll hear about this sometimes when they talk about what's happened to groundfish in Maine, because of course, as lobsters have increased in value, Maine boats cannot, lobster is a bycatch of ground fishing. And those cannot be landed in the state of Maine. This cannot be landed at the Portland Fish Exchange, where 99% of the groundfish are landed in the state. So those boats, of course, go to Massachusetts to unload, because particularly in the wintertime, when lobster gets to 11, 12, 13 foot, $15 a pound last year. And of course, a lot of those lobsters are offshore lobsters, so they tend to be bigger. That becomes a significant amount of revenue to that boat. But lobster is a bycatch is an example. And that's certainly been one of the reasons that the Maine groundfish fishery has suffered so much recently. You'll hear people talk about that sometimes in the news. But this idea of, what you catch, what goes overboard, what stays, the reporting, I can't stress enough, again, just being part of the regulatory process, how much attention, I really think it's important. I like to say this a lot because I think it's important for people to understand how carefully the resource is managed, okay? To the point where one of the first things that I noticed when I got involved on the fish pier and watching the boats come and go was that you would often see like a young person get dropped off. Many times a young woman get dropped off at the dockside, and they'd have like a pillow, and they'd have like a computer, and they'd have like a bag of stuff, and they clearly weren't a fisherman. And then you'd see them get on the boat, one of the boats that was taking ice and fuel and getting ready to make a trip. And I remember always thinking like what are they doing? Who's that person? I remember some saying like, oh, that's an observer. And I'm like, what's an observer? An observer is, up until recently, a certain percentage of trips. Every time you make a trip on a targeted species, you have to report now to your sector. You have to file now it's an electronic vessel trip report with NOAA, with the agency, so that they know that you're going on a fishing trip. And that triggers all kinds of different oversight and reporting requirements. Well, it used to be that a certain percentage of those trips were assigned an observer, and the observer with their computer would literally every single thing that came up on that trip was accounted for, was measured, was counted, was recorded, and then reported on. Recently, one of the first things that in my 3 years ago in my council lifetime, one of the first votes that I took, it had been a long time in the coming, was to go to 100% observer coverage on groundfish trips. And I think it's really important for people to understand what that means to the guys who are fishing. These are sometimes 35, 40 foot boats that have to take another person, have to provide a safe, clean, berth, a place for them to sleep, obviously bathroom, all the things that go along. And that person has to be on the boat and has to be present in every single fish that comes over, that comes on board. It's really a remarkable thing. Now, because of the pandemic and things, they haven't quite got to 100%, but it's been passed. It is now in the fishing regulations that New England groundfish have 100% observer coverage. Now, there's also electronic monitoring that's coming as well. But in addition to the fishermen themselves reporting, in addition to the dockside reportings, when the boats come into land, for instance, the Portland Fish Exchange does dockside reporting where the fish that are actually landed are then reported, all of this information going to NEFMC and NOAA Fisheries. The actual observers are on board as well. And I think it's important for people to understand just how carefully and how closely regulated and monitored our fisheries are, and how much effort and the science and the amount of resources that are spent on the ecosystem health and the individual stocks. I see another question here. Does the fisherman weigh each species on board the vessel? Is sorting required? That's a good question for you, Alex, maybe.
No, once you've done it enough, volume wise, you know what it weighs, well, within a certain amount. And with the groundfish, you have the quota. If you didn't have enough quota, you lease quota somewhere, so it's less of an issue. With the scallop, if you're over, I mean, you want to make sure you're close, but under. If you're over and they catch you, you pay daily. And even with the scallop, every trip we're going to take, we have to call 72 hours before we go and tell the National Marine Fisheries Service that we're going, and then they can send an observer. It's not 100%, but like 30% of the time they send an observer.
Yeah, and then the scallops are getting observers now, which is incredible because scallop is only so much. It's a dredge. There's only so much, and that's an interesting thing to look at, the science of scallop. How scallops are managed and how the stock assessment is. They use cameras. They're obviously scallops are a totally different thing than swimming fish, but it's remarkable how they're able to assess the health of that stock in the different fishing areas that they, scallops tend to aggregate. And of course, that scallops is the single most valuable fishery in the United States, even more than lobster. I think lobster actually last year, because it was such a good year in lobster, we might have just nosed them out a little bit, but year after year after year, scallops is an East Coast fishery all the way down to the mid-Atlantic. That's where the big fleets work out of on some of these big areas. And of course, the Nantucket, Massachusetts, Georges Bank area is huge. And now scallops, totally different fishery, but a lot of our fishermen, including Alex, have Northern Gulf of Maine permits to fish in what's considered to be the Northern Gulf of Maine. That season opens in just a couple of days, right, Alex? You're heading down. You want to talk about how guys go down there and pursue that and how that one works?
Sure. I qualified for the Northern Gulf of Maine permit, and I used to fish out here on New Lake around the 3 Mile line, but starting in, I think, 2015, they discovered a new bed of scallops that hadn't been there for a few years down in between Gloucester and Boston on Stellwagen Bank. And originally back then, there were only like 5 or 6 people using the Northern Gulf of Maine permit. Now last year we got up to 100, and everybody of that 100, like 75 or so are Mainers, and April 1st, everybody hits Gloucester and goes for Stellwagen. Then I'll be leaving tonight to go down. But one thing, if we're getting back on the island thing for a second, I was lucky enough to have a father that still did a bunch of the different fisheries. So I grew up from 8 or 10 to 15 when he left for Alaska, fishing everywhere from Gloucester to Eastport with all different kinds of fishing methods. And it gave me a desire or taste to do different fisheries, go further. And the island is just a and we have to do something to make sure that generations to come can still have, still have access to water. Sounds like it's not very good, but it's the Gulf of Maine, but we've lost so much of our fish right to southern New England that we got to get some more that's back up this way.
Yeah, Alex, I'm having a little hard time hearing you. I don't know if anyone else is. That's too bad, because that's good stuff. Is anyone else having? Is it just me with the audio?
Yeah, there seems to have been an interference. I think someone who is listening in may have had a radio go off, like whether it was a monitor or some kind of notification.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. Just picking up on that for a second. Hopefully the audio is okay here. Yeah, today was a big day of vessel services because all the scallopers were coming through, and it's a great fishery for our guys. Like Alex says, ton of Maine guys, but they all go down to Gloucester and they literally go down and get Airbnbs because it's a really limited. Every year the council sets a certain amount of quota for the stellwagen fishery, and that's a small boat fishery. It's a day boat. It's a 200-pound limit per day fishery, and so a lot of our lobstermen, smaller boats, go down there and are doing those trips. And of course, scallops is a super valuable. They're getting historic prices. They have for the last few years, and hopefully they'll continue because it's such a premium product, especially the small boat. When you get further in south of New England, and certainly into the mid-Atlantic, scallops become big boat, big business, certainly based out of New Bedford, which is a totally different fishery than the northern Gulf of Maine. And that's an example of a regulatory success that has been very deliberately trying to keep the northern Gulf of Maine, which is essentially a line if you draw it across from Boston and then everything north, which includes Stellwagen Bank, and then obviously into Maine. That whole resource, there's been a huge effort from the regulators and the council to keep that area for a smaller directed fishery, and keeping the big business scallops, which are multi-boat fleets, from coming in and really wiping it out, for lack of a better word. And so there's a lot. That's a regulatory success, to be sure. Anyways, there's a lot to talk about. I don't want to spend too much time on the regulatory structure because there's all kinds of other things. And I see we have a couple questions as well. Will they have observers on lobster boats? That is an issue. And I can tell you, whenever it comes up at the council, the Maine contingent kind of shudders because that's being discussed. Should there be observers, not just for lobsters themselves, but you heard us talk about how fish are counted. A lot of codfish and other groundfish come up. Isn't that an indicator? And shouldn't that be a so that's being discussed, and that's very possibly coming. But lobsters, and that's what I wanted to kind of move to next. I've been talking about the federally managed, the council process, NEFMC. Then there's the state management of the inshore, right? We talked about the 3 mile to 200 miles federal waters. Well, from the coast to the 3 mile is state waters. And those are managed by states, and that's a jurisdiction of the states. And the states have their own compact amongst them. The Atlantic states, you will hear sometimes people talk about the ASMFC, which is the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is a compact of all of the East Coast states, which manage collectively really inshore species. That's where lobster's managed, is through the commission. Shrimp, northern shrimp, which you hear a lot about because obviously that used to be a huge presence in Maine, which we haven't had a shrimp fishery for years and years. And now they're talking about actually closing it permanently. Shrimp, northern shrimp is managed through the commission. Other inshore things, the sea run fish, the river herring, and straight bass and bluefish. Those are all managed through the commission because it kind of makes sense when you think about it. And of course, those fish all migrate up and down the East Coast. So the commission is a whole nother regulatory body, which you'll hear about. And you can see there's a lot to it. And then these things go much deeper than obviously we're talking about. We're just giving you an idea of how, the regulatory structure works. And then of course, there's some local, I know in Freeport, we have our own clam commission or board that manages the clam flats and sets policy for that and sets those licenses. And so it goes on and on. And of course, there's a great deal of communication amongst all of these agencies, particularly the state and the federal. And the science, the work of the science, I can't stress that enough, that informs the decisions that are being made, comes from places like these science houses, GMRI and Bigelow Labs, and of course the regional science centers in Woods Hole, where marine biologists and fisheries managers are all, these are incubators of specific targeted studies and reporting and assessments that inform this regulatory process that I'm talking about. So the kind of, to put a kind of bow on it all, I would say it runs very, very deep. It's a far cry from the days where, the herring we're running, let's go out and catch as many herring as we can. It is highly regulated, and it is highly now stratified, for better or for worse. And Alex, I think you'd be better to talk about some of the frustrations that's creating with the licensing, the permitting, like maybe even just talking about your son Josh, who made the investment to buy the NGOM permit. I mean, that's a big move for a young fisherman. But you can't just go and catch the scallops down Stowaway. You got to have an NGOM permit.
Yeah, and I qualified for mine, so it was free back in the 90s, up to the 90s, everything was free. A few years ago, those permits he's talking about, the Northern Gulf of Maine permit, were 35 grand. Josh paid 85 for his a couple of years ago, and now they're like 120 or 30. The cost for a young person, or I guess an adult that wants to change his fishery, is going crazy at the moment. On the lobster thing, though, I mean, I've taken both federal and state observers quite a few times. It is already a thing. I think perhaps I don't have to take the state ones, but I think just by having the federal permit, if the feds want to send an observer with you, I'm pretty sure you have to let them go. But the tracking device is another thing. I mean, since '99, I've had basically a ankle bracelet. I mean, it's on the boat. It's I'm not saying it's as bad as a prison tracking system, but they know exactly where the boat is all the time, where it goes, what it does, which is totally fine. But it cost me $125 a month to do it. So that's yet another expense that we didn't used to have. It may be an expense that's necessary. I don't see, with the amount of lobstermen there being 100% observer coverage, but definitely the tracking device thing is coming. It's something that everybody's going to have to pay for every month in order to keep your lobster license, I feel like, for too long.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's coming. Someone asked about the observers on lobster boats, but the tracking of lobster boats. Again, all these other fisheries, every time they take a trip, they have to activate their VTR, the vessel trip reporting, and that's all tracked by Coast Guard and NOAA enforcement, and it goes back to the federal agency, and then they have to report the fish and the observer data and all the things that go with it. I mean, really, it's overwhelming in some ways. That's coming to lobster. And you're starting to hear about that because lobster has been left on its own because it's been so successful. And those issues are coming. And, I know we're going to run out of time here, and we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the current issues that are that are in the news regarding fisheries, and certainly lobster is one of them. And we talk about everyone's familiar with the right whale issue and how much stress that's putting on the industry from a number of different directions. And everyone, I think people understand right whales are an endangered species. And again, all of these processes, the Endangered Species Act is front and center. If you're ever dealing with whether it's whales or sturgeon or leatherback type turtles, anytime there's an endangered species involved in any of these regulatory matters, that becomes the only thing that's discussed. And in mitigation efforts, we're talking a lot about sturgeon right now with gill nets, because sturgeon are showing up in gill nets. But the right whale and its migration, everyone knows about that. It's so much present in the news. There's a number of different ways. Obviously, we're talking about closed areas, which has been done here in Maine. Changes to gear themselves, the gear itself, the vertical lines, and the number of traps that are fished on lines. Obviously, ship strikes are the other big source of right whale fatalities or engagements. But what I think one of the things I was going to say, I'm going to turn over to Alex to talk about it. But one of the things I think is not talked about enough, right whales is a huge looming threat. I think most people know that the Maine congressional delegation was able to get a 6-year moratorium, which is incredible. When you're talking about that goes to show how important lobster is, that our congressional delegation coordinated and they had the juice to get an extension of 6 years from that enforcement, right? Because it's a federal litigation right now where all of this is coming out of, to give the industry time to adjust. That is in itself is an incredible thing that happened. But what I think is missed sometimes is the real crisis with lobster right at this moment. And again, Alex, I'm going to turn it to you, is the economics this particular year because of the market prices. Now, some of this does come to the right whale because of the, the red listing that's been done to try and, get people to stop eating Maine lobster because of these issues. But the market price for lobster this past summer was incredibly low. And you couple that with high cost of diesel and the high cost of bait, and it becomes economically unsustainable. Frankly, right now, Alex, once you have more connection to it than I do, but there's no question we see that at our business. People talk about it every single day. That's the real present crisis right now until the price rebounds.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's back up to being pretty good. What it'll be next year is hard to say. But this summer was definitely a struggle for a lot of people. The catch was down, especially in the Bay, and the price was half what it was last year. I personally think the price was so high last year that the dealers kept it down this year to make the money they lost last year. But hopefully the next year is kind of more on the level keel price-wise.
Yeah, and that kind of goes to connection to what we were talking about. This it used to be that when certain fisheries were down, people would migrate to other fisheries, right? And then seasonally, shrimp was a winter fishery. Ground fish would start when the weather turned. Obviously, lobster, depending on whether you're inshore or offshore, has its season, scalloping, clamming. And now because of the licensing and because it's so hard, like it's, we're talking about the Northern Gulf of Maine federal scallop fishery recently. We haven't even talked about the state. The state has a scallop fishery too, which at this point is a lottery system. Like there's no chance that you're going to get a state scallop permit. I mean, am I right, Alex? Or
you're right. And no one in the industry was for the lottery system. The state legislature made them have a lottery system. The Scallop Advisory Council, we're trying to work towards a apprenticeship program kind of like the lobster one, and a lot of people don't like the lobster apprenticeship program. But having a chance to go through a program and get a license is a lot better than, you know, putting your name in a lottery. I know a handful of people from this area that have won the lottery that don't even have boats. I mean, where's the continuation of the heritage?
Fisheries.
Yeah. You know, so Mary, I don't know how long you want to go, but like, you know, the right whale, you know, there's offshore wind is obviously a big
Don't worry
topic.
about time. I think people
Okay.
are still interested.
Okay, we won't go too long. You know, we're going to touch on some of these, you know, topics that tend to be in the news right now and connect them to some of the things that
Excellent.
we've been talking about. And just moving on, you know, one of the points I think it's worth making is how unique the lobster fishery is in Maine, and how that is a product of how it's been managed in the licensing structure in Maine. Just to kind of compare that to what we've been talking about with groundfish. And that's why lobster has been left alone for so long. And now some of the questions and what we've been talking about is, you know, are they going to take observers, or now they have to have vessel tracking, and that's all creeping into lobster. And part of that is because it's, you know, it's really becoming in transition now, partly because of the right whale issue, but partly because this is what regulation does. It just starts to, you know, the ground fishermen are asking, how come the lobstermen aren't observed like we are? But it's really worth just taking a second to talk about how licensing structures a fishery. The lobster fishery in Maine has been one boat, one license owner. Okay, and it can't, and that has created the entire structure of lobstering in Maine, as opposed to ground fishing. And ground fishing went to this individual quota system, this catch share system, this quota setting and permits connected to quota and allocations, which allowed for consolidation of those permits in the name of efficiency. The best example of that's happened in the last 10 years is Blue Harvest Fisheries out of New Bedford, which is a hedge fund owned by, I believe, a Dutch family. Through Blue Harvest Fisheries out of New Bedford, have acquired boats, permits, and fishing rights in the groundfish, New England groundfish multi-species category, to the point where they own close to 15% of the entire New England groundfish. And then I call it the dirty little secret that people don't acknowledge, but we talk about it at the council, and we're talking about it more and more. They can only own up to 15%, but through the sector system, they can lease as much as they want. And why that's important, and where we've seen that effect in Maine, for instance, is over those years, over the last 10 years, Blue Harvest, and then you know, another big operator out of New Bedford, Carlos Raphael, who was a criminal and went to prison for all kinds of fisheries malfeasance. And then Blue Harvest bought all of Carlos's boats. But I can name you on two hands all of the boats that used to be Portland boats that are now owned by Blue Harvest Fisheries. And then those boats that were scrapped and those permits put on new vessels. Our biggest, newest vessel that was built about 5 years ago from one of our fishermen out of Harpswell, great fishing family, the Francis Dawn, was just bought by Blue Harvest Fisheries in all of his quota. You may have heard the name Jimmy Odland. Jimmy Odland had one of the biggest fleets in Portland until about 3-5 years ago. All of his boats were purchased by Blue Harvest, and they left the harbor. Allison Jordan, who was a Long Island family fishing, she 2 boats, bought by Carlos and then bought by Blue Harvest Fisheries. So my point is the consolidation that permitting and regulatory structure allows. And then you compare it to Maine, to lobster, where it's not possible to do that, because you have one permit, one boat, one fisherman. And that's kept the identity of the lobster fishery. And arguably, because each of those individuals is invested, it's the conservation and all the things that go with it. It's really an interesting thing to just observe and be aware of how important, how it's regulated, how it creates the real personality of the fishery itself. And you really see that up front. Like, again, I'll just talk about my day of vessel services. You see the lobstermen come in, and then you see the trip, the groundfish boats, and they're great guys, but they're all hired captains, hired crews. Someone else owns the permit, and it's just a different fishery. It's a totally different fishery. So that's an issue that's out there. Obviously, offshore wind. I don't know, Alex, you want to say anything about that? How the different licensing kind of drives the personality of these things?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. A lot of the people running those boats are people from fishing families from around here. So there is still that.
Yeah, definitely.
But not that long ago, not by regulation, just by the way it was still owner operator. I mean, back in the 80s, all the captains owned the boats not all, but for the most part. I mean, we've lost a lot of family businesses over recent years. And it wasn't just the boats you listed. Harwell Princess boat from Harpswell went south. I mean, it really is turning into, it's the Gulf of Maine.
Johnson's boat, yeah.
Yeah, right. It's the Gulf of Maine, but so much of the quota is south of Maine now.
Yeah, and the bigger boats can fish up in this area. It's nothing to them. I mean, they're called trip boats because they're out for 10, 14, even more days in good weather, and they'll go from New Bedford up all the way up down east and go back. But Portland has been a loser in that system. Okay, there's no question. It's hard to know how much of it is that catch share consolidation. But part of it also is this incredible rise of the lobster fishery. Alex and I were talking this morning. I don't think a lot of people realize the 100 million pound harvests that we've been having for the last 12 years or so in lobster, completely unprecedented. Like the harvest was never that strong. And then along with that, through the efforts of marketing and keeping the price high, typically when you get huge, gluts of anything, the price collapses. But through the efforts of the Maine market, the Lobster Marketing Collaborative and the efforts that the states put into it, to reach Asian markets, the price has stayed high along with this enormous harvest just in pounds, which is really unprecedented. It's important to understand that. And that's brought a lot of guys who are fishermen into lobster. Right. And along with that has happened, a lot of the bottom's been taken over by lobster gear. So the ground fisher, who are dragging, like they can't get in there. It's too much lobster gear. I mean, you hear people talk about this all the time. And that's another reason some of them are relocated. But the point is it changes. And anybody who's been around long, like certainly not that I've been around forever, but when you talk to people who've been around for a long time, they talk about how it changes and why flexibility is so important in all of the system, not just the licensing, but also in the regulatory system. One of the things that we talk a lot about at the council was what's referred to as ecosystem-based fisheries management, which we're trying to move in the direction of. Right now, we manage based on single species. Right, a single cod, we're going to assess codfish. Where are the codfish? Well, if for whatever reason, temperature, currents, all kinds of runoff, there's all kinds of inputs about spawning stock in areas that change. Everyone understands this, that how a species exists in an ecosystem, the predator-prey relationship. Really, none of that is taken into account with quota setting. It's either there's a historical biomass that we're counting that tells us whether or not that species is overfished and overfishing is occurring or not. And that's how we set our specifications. And everyone recognizes, especially today, that particularly climate change, temperature changes, current, which are affecting currents, are having enormous, people talk about squid. I remember people saying, squid never used to be north of Cape Cod. Squid's all over the place now. Is that right, Alex? I mean, is that a good example of a shifting species?
Yeah, even the pogies, they've never
Pogies.
but pogies haven't been here this consistently, at least in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I can say when I started 12 years ago, coming every day to the waterfront, shrimp, I mean, the wintertime, I used to look out my window from Vessel Services, and there would literally be in the evening, there would be a parade of boats coming up Portland Harbor, going to the fish exchange to unload fish. All of a sudden, it shrunk and then it was gone, and it's been gone. But like Alex says, now it's pogies. Pogies is a huge fishery in Maine now. Pogies is bigger than herring, because herring is in somewhat of a crisis itself. But Manhattan, pogies are all over the place, and all kinds, everybody's fishing on those. They're trying to catch up with the regulatory to let people, catch their own bait and all kinds of things. But that's those two species are a great example of, like, one's gone and now one's here, and then they'll be gone and hopefully something else. And the point is, the regulatory framework is not really built for that. I'm telling you, because we lament it when we're sitting there at the council table talking about these things, that it's the system and the legal structure is not built for that. And that's where something like ecosystem-based fisheries management comes in, where you're talking about the ecosystem as a whole. And we're moving in that direction, but it's very, very difficult. Very difficult. I don't know. Is there Alex, is there anything you want to talk about? Like, I don't know if you want to talk about offshore wind or anything.
Offshore wind scares me, that's for sure. I mean, the proposals that are on the board for so many wind farms, I mean, we're going to lose so much bottom, so much places we can fish if it comes through. And it doesn't even, I mean, I'm for clean energy, but it doesn't seem like it's cost effective, at least at the moment.
Yeah, and that's a big issue, obviously, in federal waters. And as much as we're talking about it here in Maine and our research array and this, trying to decide where the quote unquote research array should go, if you look at a map of southern New England in the amount of projects that are already permitted off of Long Island and Block Island and Rhode Island, and it will blow your mind the amount of wind energy that's getting underway down in that area. Again, it's already permitted, and you can imagine the pressure that puts on fisheries managers. That's not managed. That's the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, but they're constantly coming to the council because they want our input on the things that they're doing, and it's incredibly controversial with fishermen. Because, of course, just in this little talk, I think we're giving you a little sample of how much regulation and oversight fishermen are subject to, and how careful that they are with the resource. And now you're seeing offshore wind, and many people feel like a great, some of you may have seen in the news, this is very much in the news, the number of whales that are showing up dead in southern New England. Not just right whales, but whales in general that are washing up. And the theory is that the sonar pinging that they're doing to assess the bottom for the wind farms that have already been permitted is causing the whales to lose their navigation. Perfectly reasonable. It's as reasonable as anything. And they feel like, they're dragging their feet on doing those assessments of what's happening there. That's just an example. But I think the overall theme is, it's a shared resource. It's a common resource. Traditionally, it's been fishing. It used to be really wide open fishing, open access fishing. And I think we've talked a little bit about how the regulatory process has kind of changed that. Now it's kind of, through licensing and really necessity because of pressure to restrict that. But now these other needs are coming in. Offshore wind is a huge one. Obviously, the needs of endangered species. Aquaculture, we haven't talked about aquaculture. Aquaculture, everyone knows, all of you folks on the island now, inshore aquaculture is exploding. The lease applications are through the roof. I can tell you that kelp the product itself, it's a real thing. It's not, it used to be, if you asked me 3 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, some people do that. I don't know. Not anymore. It's a real thing. It's people's making real money at it. The lease applications are exploding. That's inshore aquaculture. Then you have big aquaculture, which is offshore, which again just creates pressure on the resource. And how do you determine whose interests are heard? Everyone's interest is heard. That's what the process is for, but it becomes hard to manage.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm just curious, and I sorry I was in and out through a lot of this, but how much is your voice is being heard? Because I know that Alex and I have had conversations about the right whale, and if they licensed lobstermen to, if there's a right whale trapped, like acknowledge that there's lobstermen there that would go and free them. And right now they're going to get penalized if they go and free them. Are they listening to them like they want to help and they want to help in this process? Is that voice being heard?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I always say, as someone, again, I'm just happen to be a New England council member. There's all kinds of other regulatory boards. But I will tell you from a council perspective, there is nothing more effective to shaping the discussion and really even shaping policy than a room full of fishermen. When they come, an individual can be very, very persuasive and interject into the process. There's no question about that. But when there's a room full of them and they all, whatever the issue, we had a meeting in Gloucester last year on a really particular scallop issue about they wanted to bring catch shares into scallops, and literally the room was full of scallopmen from New Bedford. The mayor was there, the federal representative was there. I mean, because they did not want to move towards catch shares. It's very persuasive in the process, but it's like anything, it's time and a place, but I can tell you in the regulatory process, it's very persuasive. One of the problems is people only have so much time. And they're constantly, if you talk to people at DMR, our Department of Marine Resources, and certainly on the federal level, they're constantly trying to get fishermen to, I mean, Alex, how many times have you asked? Because Alex is very involved. Alex is the president or the chairman of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. You must get asked all the time to engage in these discussions.
Yeah, not usually recorded Zooms or whatever, but yeah, I definitely do. And the scallop meetings, and I'm on the Maine Scallop Advisory Council, but it definitely takes up a lot of your time. And like the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association, they don't just, it started as a groundfish sector, but they look after all the fisheries. And nowadays, you got to be a lawyer and a fisherman. And without somebody like the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association, people looking out for what's coming down for laws, that's a fisherman would be lost. I mean, these big boat companies, like you say, that one guy owns 15% of the groundfish stock for the year. I mean, he has time. He's not out there fishing. He's got time to go to all the meetings. He's got lawyers.
Oh yeah, he's got representatives there at every meeting.
I mean, you can't just be a fisherman anymore. You have to have somebody looking out for you.
Yeah, but I mean, to answer the question, it's very persuasive. The problem is, I have conversations with fishermen all the time about things that are in front of the council. The problem is the legal structure. Like, there's only so much we have as council members. Like, I can disagree all I want with an 85% cut to the Gulf of Maine haddock quota for the upcoming year, and I can question the science, and I can pick it apart, and I can stomp on the table and say I'm not voting for it. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, we make our recommendations to the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is NEFMC, which is NOAA Fisheries. They're the ones. And if we don't take the best available science, trying to kind of tie this together a little bit, if we ignore the best available science as it's presented to us, they won't accept the recommendation. They simply will do. Sometimes they'll even say, well, if you don't set specifications at this meeting, we're not going to be able to, we're not going to have any default measures in time for the upcoming fishing year, which means that certain fisheries may be closed, not just cut, but closed. And, I don't want to be over dramatic about it because everyone is collaborative. It is a collaborative, and everyone's interest. Everyone does have an interest. I do want to say this. I don't want to represent it. The scientists, the regulators, the fishermen, the conservationists, all this, everyone who's at the table really is trying. But it's hard. It's hard to count fish. It's hard to know exactly what's happening in an ecosystem. And then you're restricted by really particular laws that require certain action based on certain inputs. So anyways, it's kind of a long answer, but.
Everything's in.
So what can we do as a community to rally around them? Like, I'm trying to be very proactive here. Like, I'm hearing all you're saying, and I get it's very complicated, but I feel like we as a community of these lobstermen, the scallopmen, the fishermen need to do something. I mean, we need to be proactive. So I guess I'm asking you, how can we help you? How can we make this fight better? Because I feel like they have more money than we do, and I feel like they have more power than we do. So what do we do as citizens who want to support our lobstermen, our scallopmen, and yet at the same time very much protect the seawaters? What can we do to help you? That's what I want to know.
Yeah.
I do know that we can donate through the organization that Alex is president of the board. Alex, what's the website?
I'd have to look up what the website is, but it's the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association.
If you just put that in, that will get you to the website, and you can donate.
They're incredible advocates for the industry. They are the advocate. That's a very good answer. They are the advocate. I would say Maine Coast Fishermen, because they are doing incredible advocacy, and then valuing and buying local seafood, like real local seafood, from your, knowing where it is. I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but when you go and have your haddock sandwich at whatever waterfront place, chances are that is not Maine haddock, even though it's served at a Maine waterfront restaurant. That's coming in on the Imeskip container ships. It's frozen at sea product. It's very good product. Our local processors are processing it, but that is not being landed at the Portland Fish Exchange. You can ask where it's from, and even better, seek out a harvester and pay top dollar for whatever seafood it is. It's getting to be scallop season. I mean, if you can get them, because everybody wants those, then that's the best seafood, if you ask me, this time of year. But the Maine Coast, and Maine Coast is a great resource.
Alex, did you have any other comments for Regina and how we can help as a community?
It's hard because you have to be a Portland resident to vote in Portland for zoning things and stuff, but we're definitely in every coastal town, we're losing access to the water. I mean, whatever town everybody's in anywhere, or whatever they actually have a say in, try to make sure that there's still commercial fishing access. Because, I mean, when I was a little kid, just about all the docks in Portland were commercial, and now just 2 or 3 are. I mean, we're losing places to tie up in every harbor in the state. Not for that matter, in Gloucester as well.
Thank you, Alex. Do we have any other questions or comments?
I just would like to say, I was Alex's teacher at one point, and I am so proud of Alex, and he knows that. And someday Alex is going to write a wonderful book, because he is a great writer too. And so this was, I come from a fishing family, and this was wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you.
I
Thank
think
you.
we can unmute everyone so we could perhaps applaud. Let's see. Start your videos and unmute, please. Let's see who's still with us.
say hi. You're on now. Yeah, look at the camera and say hi. Say hi.
That me?
Yeah.
Hey,
All right, are we all, yay for
Why can't
Alex
you do
and
it?
Alan, thank you
The host is
so
disordered.
much.
Thank you.
It was fabulous, and truly, if anyone has any, thank you, Teddy, if anyone has any other comments, speak right up.